Not only is it a good Lutheran hymn, but boy, the message in that, especially the last verse, is just outstanding. And you need to hear that kind of an uplifting message because, first of all, my sermon is not going to be uplifting. And second, because at this time of the year in Lent, and at this time in our history, there's just a lot of junk going on in the world that can tear you down. Life is a series of decision moments, kind of, where you make important decisions. In fact, you might say it's just kind of an unending series. Once you start making them, it's kind of hard to stop and to decide which one is the most important, the one you make most recently, when you have to make. The first major moment, I think, for most of us comes, toward the end of high school, about the age of 18, when we determine whether or not we're going to go to college. And that used to be a fairly simple decision process. I mean, it was a big decision for me, but I don't remember having to go through what my kids went through, and I think it's gotten even worse. You have to do a multi-year process that entails multiple applications. There is the long shot and the sure thing and the fallback position and the one that everybody can afford and the one that nobody can afford, but you like to get that acceptance letter anyway so you can put it on your wall and tell people that you got accepted to Harvard, Yale, or whatever it is. Big decisions about whether you join the military, you find a job. You do nothing at all with your life until your parents kick you out and you have to do something. I know there's some parents that have talked to me about that. I wouldn't know what that's like. My children are all gainfully employed now. Well, most of them anyway. In life comes these big moments. Marry, not to marry. Do you settle for a job? Do you do a career? It's like the tectonic plates of your life upheave and then they settle and snap into place, and you look around and the landscape is completely different than it was before. A couple weeks ago in the Gospel of Mark, we were reading of such a time long ago when two young men are facing a time of decision, two fishermen actually. They're standing knee-deep in the waters of the Sea of Galilee, and another young man walks by. He walks by on the beach. He stops to look at them. They're casting their nets. They make eye contact. He looks at them and he says, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And as the story goes, they dropped the nets and they followed. And their lives, and I think probably all of our lives, were never the same because of that moment of decision. And today we hear a similar story. It comes from the middle of Mark's gospel. Here there are now 12 following Jesus on their way to a place called Caesarea Philippi. They're going through the rolling hills of Galilee from village to village, and they've watched him heal, and they've listened as he said, really outrageous things they'd never heard before, like, love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you, forgive those who offend you, love one another. And in this particular moment, Jesus turns his attention away from the pleasant serenity of all these fishing villages and fields of lilies, the places around him in Galilee, and he starts to direct them toward the cobbled avenues and urban confusion of Jerusalem. On this day, he startles them all by asking a simple question: who do people say that I am? And Peter, of all people, Peter, replies with the staggering claim, "Well, you are the Messiah. You are the Christ." And Jesus chooses this moment to make another drastic proclamation that the journey they are now a part of will end in Jerusalem. It will end in his suffering. It will end in his betrayal and his death. And then he says, I think, the most radical thing in the New Testament, maybe the most radical thing ever said. "If anyone wants to become my follower, let them deny themselves, take up a cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." He'd never mentioned the cross before, not once. They all knew what a cross was. The Romans had introduced crosses, this appallingly cruel and brutal means of executing traitors as a way of keeping the peace. Take up your cross, Jesus says. That's not exactly the best marketing strategy I've ever heard of. Bear a cross, lose your life. You're not going to see that on one of these signboards out front of a church. Doesn't exactly foster church growth. But that's why I think that every generation since that moment, just like those first Christians, have done their best not to deny themselves, but to deny the cross. Because let's face it, we prefer resurrection to crucifixion. We like Easter better than we do Good Friday. It's not an accident that on Friday you might get 75 or 80 people, but on Easter morning you got 500. We like happy endings. Our most common reference to the horror of crucifixion is a sanitized piece of jewelry we wear around our necks. Doesn't even have a cross, a Christ on it anymore. I've heard it before whenever I've tried to use a crucifix, and I use them fairly often. I don't want to see Jesus on a cross. After all, he's not there, he's risen. I beg to differ. He is there, and you know why I know it? We nailed him there. Good folks like us, we nailed him there. You want to know who sees Christ on the cross most clearly? I'll tell you. Anyone who has to live with the reality of suffering. The poor and the miserable, they know where to find Jesus. The oppressed, the sick, the dying, the helpless, the frightened, they know what it means to live in the shadow of a cross. And we know also what it means to live in the shadow of a cross. Because most of human history exists in the shadow of a cross. A good man dies outside the walls of Jerusalem, caught up in the swirling political and religious prejudices of his day. The cross was there. The cross cast its long shadow during the Holocaust, where 6 million plus Jews were murdered in gas chambers and burned to ash in crematoriums on one side of a brick wall, while literally on the other side, good Lutherans went to church and prayed to that God. And on St. Valentine's Day, while we put ashes on our foreheads and gave chocolates to our sweethearts, the cross cast its long shadow over a high school in Parkland, Florida, where 14 children were murdered by a man bearing an AR-15. The shadow of a cross is where we live every day. It's where history exists. Carry a cross? Not hardly. The cross is what we all seek to avoid. But it's important to remember that Jesus did not seek to avoid it. He chose to go to Jerusalem. Mark's gospel, the first to attempt to write about his life, introduces Jesus as a rabbi, a teacher, a wonder worker who attracts these huge, enormous crowds of people out in Galilee, a rural farming and fishing district nestled about a lake they called Gennesaret, which means the heart-shaped lake. It was far from Jerusalem. It was there in the villages and synagogues where he traveled and taught and healed, and the people, they responded. But it was also there as we read that there were deeper, more sinister forces at work. Conflicts were brewing, and exactly halfway through his story, Mark describes this pivotal incident, this moment of decision, where out of the blue, Jesus says he's going to suffer and be rejected and then die. Come on along. And his friends are stunned. That's why Peter pulls him aside privately and says, come on, Jesus, don't be such a drama queen. Nothing like that's going to happen to you. But Peter, Jesus' disciple and friend, has inadvertently touched upon his deepest vulnerability. Because the truth is, Jesus did not have to go to Jerusalem. He did not have to ascend the cross. He could have continued living the life of an itinerant rabbi, pleasantly dwelling at Capernaum, making a living at carpentry, and when the Spirit moved him and time allowed, to teach a little and heal a little, and maybe get married and settle down and have a family, and attend synagogue with his boys like any good Jewish son was expected to do. You know, people hated Martin Scorsese's movie, The Last Temptation of Christ. You know why? Because it suggested, and rightly I think, that Jesus was tempted not to do it, to live that safe, quiet life in Galilee. But he didn't, because in his heart and soul there resided this profound truth of God, the truth he shared with his disciples on that day. Those who want to save their lives will lose it, but those who lose their lives for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. 3 times in Mark's gospel, 3 times Jesus predicts his own death. 3 times he tries to warn his friends. 3 times they will have none of it. 3 times they deny the cross. And when they finally go to Jerusalem at Passover, Jesus goes out of his way to enact one of his people's most precious hopes, that the Messiah would ride into Jerusalem, down the Mount of Olives, cross the valley of the Hinnom, up the slopes of Zion on a donkey, like the Davidic kings of old. And when the people saw him doing that, they ripped palm branches from the trees. They laid their coats on the ground in front of him. They shouted, Hosanna, son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And this public demonstration started in motion the forces which would take exactly 5 days to nail him to a cross. And he decided that's the way it had to be. He meant to make a statement, to be who he must be. And his act, this courage, his integrity, forces his disciples also to make the decision, will you stand with me or will you not stand with me? And that's why Mark's story is so troubling. That's why these moments of decision are so difficult for us. Because like I said, we like happy endings. We want religion to be inspiring and uplifting and positive. And you tell me, what is inspiring and uplifting and positive about that? So we avoid hard conversations about death. We avoid hard conversations about things we just don't want to talk about. Or how else can you explain how over the last 14 years, as our children have been slaughtered in schools, we conclude every one of those events by doing nothing? Nothing. Nothing. We say things like it's too early to talk about this. We don't want to politicize this. Well, as my father used to say, denial ain't just a river in Egypt. It is central to the Christian faith that it was not just some well-meaning teacher from Galilee that got caught up in the web of political intrigue who was hung on a cross. It was the Messiah of God. It was God himself acting in human history, God coming dramatically among us in the life of Jesus. And what happened to this Jesus on that Friday afternoon in Jerusalem was not some story of human tragedy. It was the story of God's unyielding love for this world. For God so loved the world. He loved the world where people get sick and die. He loved the world where innocents suffer and the good does not always prevail. He loved the world of tragedy with its loss and its grief, where 14 children are mercilessly gunned down in their own schools, a world that crucified his only begotten Son. That's the world that God loves. And those of us who are foolish enough to stand up in a pulpit and speak of that, and those of you who are brave enough to come to church on Sunday and hear that, can only confess that in the end, that love of God, that love that exists in the shadow of a cross, is the only thing that matters. It's the only thing that helps us to make sense of the suffering and the tragedy in this world. God's love does not do away with conflict or with death. God's love is that which makes it possible to bear it, to look upon it, to look beyond it. For the cross is not just a symbol of God's love. It's an invitation to live your life as Jesus did, with commitment and courage, to make the decision to go to Jerusalem and risk everything, to give what you have, to love and care deeply, to be open to suffering and to be vulnerable and to be as alive as God wishes us to be free and whole and safe in the love of the one who said, those who lose their lives for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save them. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was 39 years old when he died. 39. He wrote an important book, The Cost of Discipleship, which some of us have read, where he talks about cheap grace. And that phrase has been tossed around and used casually and carelessly for the many years since he died. But what cheap grace is for him is religion without a cross. Religion without a cross. The Christian faith that has no cost, no demands, requires no sacrifice, isn't worth your life. When Christ calls a man to follow, he wrote in his book, he bids him to come and die. Bonhoeffer's last week was spent in a concentration camp with prisoners drawn from all over Europe. Among them was an English officer who later wrote these words. Bonhoeffer, he wrote, was all humility and sweetness. He always seemed to me to diffuse an atmosphere of happiness, of joy in every smallest event, and of deep gratitude for the mere fact that he was alive. He's one of the very few men that I've ever met to whom God was real and close. On Sunday, April the 8th of 1945, Pastor Bonhoeffer held a service and spoke to us in a manner which reached the hearts of us all, finding just the right words to express the spirit of our imprisonment and his thoughts and resolutions. And he'd hardly finished his last prayer when the door opened and two evil-looking men in civilian clothes came in and said, "Prisoner Bonhoeffer, come with us." And those words, "come with us," meant only one thing: the gallows. So we bade him goodbye, and he drew me aside, and he said, "This is the end, but for me, it is the beginning of life." Come with me, Jesus said, and I will make you fishers of men. He said that to Peter and the disciples, and then he went to the cross. Come with us, the Gestapo said, and they took Bonhoeffer to the gallows. Invitations to follow. Times in life, these are moments of decision. We have only one life in which to respond to the most important invitation ever made. If anyone wants to become my follower, let them deny themselves, take up a cross, and follow me. And so we will. For we know that history exists in the shadow of that cross. And because of Christ, we also know that cross does not point to the end. It points to the beginning. To God be the glory. Amen.